Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to another recording of architectural sketching. We will be working today on another sketch, this time in mixed media. Up until this point, we've had a number of drawings focused on a single type, although some of them have mixed up a little bit with ink and colored pencil. But today I will be showing an example of how to use graphite, ink, and colored pencil together and how you can utilize each of them in their own way, kind of using the strength of each one of them. And so we're going to be looking at a photo today. Our subject matter will be River City. This is a Bertrand Goldberg building. And again, as with some of our latest subject matters, not a whole lot of this seems very rational with the idea of perspective with vanishing points and the horizon line. But I'm going to try to break it down into more manageable pieces that are easier to understand and maybe give you a method to kind of strip away some of the complexities of all of these curved elements. So right away, I think this might be the first one. I don't know, perhaps maybe the second one that we're focusing on a portrait vertical orientation rather than landscape. And so I'm going to take advantage of the verticality in the image and orient my page in the same fashion so that you can see my binding here is on the left. And so I have a vertical piece of paper that I'll start with. And as always, I will have this posted on Canvas. So by the time you are able to view this, you'll have the image posted that you can refer to as you're drawing it. And so I'll, of course, be bringing it in and out of screen. But just to give you an idea as we start, the horizon line here is where everything becomes flat, truly horizontal. And so here you can see we're still able to see the underside of part of the slab. Of course, everything else above there we're able to easily see as it builds up multiple stories. And the water is beneath our reference point where our eye perspective is. So this slab in the distance looks relatively flat based on the bottom of the image. And so this is really where we would expect the horizon line to be. So that means everything is vanishing in a way away from us. The closest point in the foreground would be this concrete pier. Even though they're arcing away, and some of these boats block where those columns are coming into the water, that's arcing up and away towards a vanishing point in the distance on the horizon line. And everything above, which is the majority of the images above this line, those are all wrapping around and vanishing down to this horizon line as well. So it's just important to keep in mind that that line is very important. Everything is reaching down to this point and up, depending on whether you're above it or below it. And as you move further and further towards the left of the image, things begin to flatten out a little bit, but you can still see a very subtle relationship between the horizon line being flat here. This is angling down. So this face of the building is responding to a vanishing point off page to the left. You can see the joints in the cast in place concrete pour, the form liners are all responding to a similar point as they angle further and further towards the top of the building. And then everything is flattened out quite a bit at the base. And then there's a lot of kind of noise and different type of clutter, for lack of a better word. It's really these like boats in front of boats. So this could trip people up. You might even remove the boats and just kind of clean this up as much as possible. I kind of like the noise, as I call it, in the foreground. It adds to it the scene that you're trying to create, the context. And so one of the most iconic things about this building is, of course, it's built right onto the water. And so being able to show some of those boats really highlight the fact that that is an active waterfront. You could remove all the boats and simply have a seawall that goes straight in front of the building and then just show water. You could do that as well, because the reflectivity of the building can also be enhanced there if you don't have so much of that clutter in the foreground. So as always, I'm going to start off with very, very light construction lines, just so that I can begin to check myself as I work through the geometries here, knowing that these lines in the end are going to kind of go away. I may not even need to come back and erase them. So again, the horizon line, very important. I want to make sure that I'm utilizing the page to the best, that I'm framing this. And so I want to leave a margin, and I know that based on the image, there's these two flat faces, and they kind of, this Bertrand Goldberg is always famous for his curving buildings. River City and Marina City, Prentice Hospital, just to name a few, all of them are very, very important architectural pieces of landmarks in Chicago, although Prentice has been demolished, sadly. Uh, this building was actually only built in 1986, so not terribly old, and it stood all alone in the South Loop neighborhood for many years with no development happening up until very recently. So I want to make sure that I captured these two elements that really are existing on the left-hand side of the image. And I also want to make sure that I'm capturing a lot of this arcing element, the kind of foreground to the right. And so once I've established these elements on the left, I want to just indicate a very, very gentle curve. That's the kind of, not focusing on all of the individual punched openings in the concrete or the balconies or how many pieces there are that make this up. The first thing I want to do is make sure that I get the perspective down. I don't want to focus on little pieces and then in the end realize that it just wasn't working out the way I wanted it to and have to go back. So before I go too far, I really want to make sure that I'm able to, with some confidence, say that I've got a good perspective down. So, and in this case, I do not necessarily want to count floors. That's not the point of the exercise. But the bays, the number of these tower elements that are grouped together is rather important. And it's not that many. It's easy to understand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 here, and maybe 4 scallops on this towards the right that's coming out towards you in the foreground. And so I would just want to make sure that I'm capturing all of this with some degree of confidence. And so it may take a little bit, these are some unusual forms. These, as they curve around the base of the tower here on kind of stilts, how they come up and then kind of move around to create a flattened arch or arc, and then they cut back, and some of them translate into the vertical piece of the column, and others are running into the side of another element, and that neighboring element is really what's creating the vertical component that runs into the water. So it's important to just understand those basic ideas as you're laying this out. And so there's no real hard and fast rules as to which elements you focus on first. But as I go through this, and of course, as you get more towards the foreground, things are going to become more apparent to you. As you get towards these elements towards the background, they flatten out a bit more. You're looking at them almost more in elevation, but here in the foreground, you're seeing things much more in perspective. And so that, because you're seeing it in perspective and you're seeing it in greater detail, it's important to capture this as it's drawn and as you see it. And so as these kind of these arcing elements come around, you're making sure that you're identifying the width of each of these. Of course, they're not paper thin. You have to show how even the small edge here, you're going to have those 2 lines that's indicated here. And then again, another piece that's flattening in. So you can start to understand the complexities that Bertrand Goldberg has here. It's not just simply a repetition of the same geometry here. You can see that they're alternating. Some of those geometries die into others. Some are completed forms and others aren't. So now with this arc, you can start to see how that curve can be developed. And then you have these concrete piers that you can then start to take lines up from. And those are going to be, we're not focusing in this image. You can see that the way that the image was taken, the verticals are truly vertical. We're not collapsing and looking at a vanishing point towards the sky. So we just are concerned here with developing consistent line that raises up off of these kind of scalloped edges. And then, of course, we also have to contend with this idea of the arc that is created through the edge of the balcony, this kind of walkway that, again, just focusing on those construction lines, light enough that I don't have to come back and do too much erasing, but I have to keep that in mind. Come back with a little more intent. Always remembering how those faces are interacting with one another. They're not simply passing across, they're actually being interrupted in this case. And then again, remember that my vanishing line is here, and like I talked about from the start, that lowered edge of that slab is rising just a little bit above our vantage point. So then by the time you get to this pier, you don't even see it's a kind of consistent arc. It might help to draw that as one arc rather than several single ones. As you can see, I started losing some of that consistency across all of them because I did several different arcs. You can always come back and clean that up. You can erase those construction lines later. And then there's a storefront to the back. The slab. Again, another storefront here. So you have a series of mullions. And that'll also get interrupted by the balcony railing. The balcony railing is a series of vertical pickets that will be much more prominent than the storefront beyond. And this is hardly able to see. I'm already kind of drawing off page. But here you can see it appears as though the concrete actually becomes a bit wider as it runs into the water here. So that's really going to be the bottom of my image. It's just barely off screen, but there you can see it. In this portrait orientation, the very top of my page and perhaps the very bottom might get cut off, but I think that when you reference the photo, you can see that more clearly. And then the same idea here. The base of these are visible before they run into the water. And it's very dark here underneath the building, and in this photo, it printed very dark as well, but I do see a boat, so sometimes, you know, you could just say this is all shadow. I don't want to show all the boats because that's a lot of detail that I might not want to focus on, but I'll draw them in. You don't have to. So again, I'm going to start running into a lot of other of this kind of clutter of the boats, and you again don't have to draw this. I'm going to, just because it's there, it's visible, and I can draw it quickly enough. I don't have to draw every little thing, because if you look closely enough, you can see there's just so many little ropes and boxes and stands everywhere all over here. You can just simply clean that up if you don't want to draw all of it or none of it at all. Okay, so then I've got my foreground to the right established for the most part. I'm going to try to work on the verticals first before I come back and start adding in some of the windows that create kind of the horizontal groupings. So if I come back here again, I started with these two flat elements. There's what appears to be a gap between them with some kind of diagonal. Maybe that's even a stair. There's lots of hidden little staircases, like another one here. So there's a series of kind of slab edges that are expressed there. And then there's a stair that's like flying off to the side here. But before I get to that, I want to establish how the building comes down to meet its base, which is this horizontal piece. So with that, these kind of conceptually, these flattened arches create a three-part facade, and then another expressed slab edge here. And now that slab is going to be read as being very much flattened. As I come across this, it's just slightly arcing, almost flat, but it's above my eye elevation. So the furthest point of it is going to be the lowest. As it reaches up towards this corner, it's coming a little bit closer to my eye. So I'm seeing this arc just very, very gently. And then there is another, which looks to be recessed right behind it, which would be almost truly flat. That is really, really close to my elevation in the distance. Really close, maybe just a hair above the horizon line, which I've drawn there. And here again, I want to focus on the base. These arcs are all different. And so I want to be able to show them. And again, how many pieces do I have to contend with here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've already established one here. And they also exist at different elevations. So 3, 4, 5, 6, something like this. Because once you have those vertical pieces, you can just take those lines down. And you might even realize you might want to creep that one up a little bit. Again, it's not going to be perfect. It's not the kind of thing you want to spend too much time on, but the proportions should be relatively accurate so that when you look at this, you look at the photo, you can see the relationships. And then it's going back and adding these arcs just to set up the massing of this building. And it looks like you're just getting a little bit of an arc here. And then those, again, the vertical elements that reach down. I think what I'm always trying to get at with these construction lines is to not look at a drawing like this and then just start here, draw a window, draw outline, draw another one, another, and then you kind of go down like this. I find that that leads to problems because you want to think about this holistically and then get into the details. Otherwise, you're kind of boxing yourself into the decisions you made at the beginning. And then by the time you find that you've made some errors in some of those proportions or geometries, it's very hard to come back from that. All right, so then here we are now, the base, this is where the water line would be, and it appears as though there's a concrete upturn and then a seawall underneath it. So it's almost like two separate walls, one stacked on top of another. And then again, with the boats, that you don't have to draw these, but because they're in the foreground, I'm going to come to those next and just give an idea of, and I don't know the geometries of boating very well. I don't spend much time on boats, but I can just come across with some big swooping lines that mimic what's happening here. Someone who actually owns these kind of boats would be like thinking that that's not exactly how that should work, but I'm not going to spend the time to figure out how to draw this because it's not that crucial to the design of the building. And just gesturally, I want to spend more time on the building, so I could come back and then just draw a little bit, give an idea of the shape of these boats, nothing more than that. And they're quite low, so they don't really cover up much of the building. In the background, then, there is a recess. Bertrand Goldberg has, in many cases, both at Marina City and at River City, taken this idea of coming straight down into the water and then pulling the geometry of the building back. So you're going to see a lot of dark, like this Pelotti's idea, similar to Corbusier, that has done in many of his buildings stilts that reach down to the earth and then lifts most of the living space above the ground floor. And so same thing here, there's going to be a window wall that is expressed behind in the shadows of these elements. And then you can come back we see here that there is a series of balcony edges and these interestingly kind of formed rounded corners of um, punched openings in the concrete. So we're alternating between the arc represented by a double line of balconies. And again, I'm not going to count every floor. I just want to get enough to kind of get those proportions right. I can come back when I'm finalizing this with ink or some heavier line. Still in my construction line phase right now. I'm not quite to the point where I want to make that switch. But remember, as this arc, this circular form is more dramatic at the top as it flattens out so much at the base. I want to make sure that, and I could even start indicating before I go too far, these lines are basically the angles that I'm going to end up with as I come across with my final line after construction lines are done. So you can start to see I've created those just guidelines to show this arc. And the same thing can be said for this, a kind of guide that just, it opens up more and more the higher you go. And so the interesting thing in this building also is in plan, it's an S shape. But then within that S, there are all of these small arcs that are bunched up next to one another. And so in this case, I drew these lines as one swoop, but in reality, it's a multitude of smaller arcs that are connected to create this geometry. So if I have these 2 points that would exist on a single line, I actually have to then arc that, connecting these 2 points and arc that again, so that I'm developing a different type of system that's not just a single arc, but a series of smaller arcs that are connected. So you can start to see how it's one massing that's fluid, but then within it there are smaller pieces. And that will help you understand more about then how do we shape the windows within each of these sections. So then going back, perhaps the most tedious thing here is capturing the way that these are formed. These windows are not simply just rectangles or squares. They actually are, and again, very, very subtle, but this, again, I could do this arcing again, but I'm following that flat line that I've created. Each one of them are actually arced. So it kind of plays tricks on you. This is a concave form, but then each one of these are convex. They're pushed out. So they're kind of working against one another, not the way you would expect this form to take shape, but each one of these has its own geometry, kind of connecting the points that is the concave, but then the convex form is creating this kind of honeycomb effect. And so then when you come, now that you've got all these construction lines, you could make the switch. You could go into more definitive line work. There's interesting, this building was built within the last few years. It's called the Reed, and it's towers over this building, but since 1986, this building was on its own without any real context built up next to it until very recently. So it's your choice to whether or not you want to include this building. And if you do, I would certainly not draw attention to it. In the photo, it looks like very dark compared to the exposed kind of buff color of the concrete at River City. So if you are to draw this, that's fine, but I would not want to draw too much attention to it. So I'll draw it, but when I come back with my more definitive final line work, I will lighten it up to the point where it might just be single lines rather than any tone. But also remember that like these faces, they are responding to the horizon line very much like this building is. So these faces are perpendicular to one another. So as you do this, you might want to take your pencil and realize roughly what these angles are. Because as we go up, these slab edges are going to be collapsing down to a vanishing point somewhere over here. It's not all just going to be the same angle as you go up the building. It flattens out, of course, as you get low at the horizon line. But it's good to plan these things, because if I just took my ink pen or something and just started drawing lines, eventually I might realize I've focused on this and it doesn't really relate to the geometry of everything else. So this would end up looking like a geometry that's not accurate. So that I can just come back later. And again, I don't want to add too much emphasis on what's happening in this building because it's not helping. You could even not include it at all. You could just maybe just have a box of a building back here. I think across the street on Wells, there's a bunch of old 10-story warehouse buildings. So you could just draw something that looks like it's some generic box. It wouldn't be the kind of thing that anybody would call you out on. All right, so with this, the last thing I want to do before I jump into more final line work is just to try to understand. You could count the number of windows here. I don't really like to do that, but I do want to be able to understand how these windows are going to behave. They're kind of collapsing, they're arcing, they're not easy to understand right away. So I might want to just plan around how am I going to make these. Could do like a series of these diagonals that indicate where the openings will become, and then arc. They become more flat here, so they're a little bit easier to understand as they flatten out. It's kind of two lines and then an angle on one side. So once you get comfortable, like you understand where these geometries are falling, then you could just jump into your final line work again. So and the last thing, again, I maybe jumped ahead a little bit, is this. What you see in the foreground is highly visible, of course. So you want to make sure that you've captured this accurately enough, because it's really going to stand out if those geometries aren't working well. And just remember the reference points you have. You have the reference point of this plane, and so the way those align with one another is important to keep that relationship. Like these are all aligned. They're stacking. And here, this kind of scallop effect can throw you off, but that's why this guideline is supposed to be there to help you understand that there's a floor line back there that obviously is flat. So this is really perhaps the most challenging, is trying to get these things to line up, knowing that they're all in perspective and the geometry of each of them is slightly unique. It's not the kind of form we're used to dealing with. Okay, and here, so this one looks like it's captured. And now in this case, it looks as if the slab is here and then there's kind of like a brow that rises up. It's not the same kind of relationship. So these windows are unique. And each of them will have, of course, the head. And so we can come back and then you can start adding them. These are the mullions that would be within that. Okay, so this is really where I think that it would be a good spot to move into more final line work. And I am gonna, like I mentioned earlier, I'm gonna work with pen. And I actually made a big no-no, which, remember how I said, this was where I had the Thompson Center earlier, and I didn't put a piece of paper underneath it. So the reason I'm looking at doing ink here is because if I went straight into graphite, I would start to see the Thompson Center underneath all of this line work, which if you had protected, now I was smart here today, I didn't put any paper underneath my drawing now, so I am not worried about having to imprint this on another piece of paper underneath. So the first thing I want to do is go over some of that line work with much more intentional lines, in this case in ink. And again, with mixed media, you can utilize different types, whatever you're more comfortable with. Maybe you've decided, oh, I don't like the permanency of ink. I don't feel confident in it just yet. That's fine. You can work in pencil, or you could do colored pencil. You could even do this in watercolor if you want. If you're comfortable, you enjoy doing that. I don't want to hold any, I want to just expose everyone to these different types of media, and then it's really up to you to figure out what it is that you're comfortable with. This is that stair that I mentioned earlier that reaches out. Some of you, I think, are more comfortable doing these kind of buildings using a ruler. That's fine as well. Some of you have probably noticed my line types vary with intent. Some of them I do kind of a dot dash, dot dash. That I do because I've noticed that there's a hard edge here, but where the balcony comes in, that there isn't really an edge that is consistent all the way down. So I'm not counting balconies, but I'm trying to give myself a little bit of breathing room when it comes to finalizing this. So that line I kind of left open-ended. And I'm also using a heavier line than I normally would to start with. This is the Pilot fine liner. Normally I start off with the Micron 1, that's the smallest and lightest line weight. Then I can go back and add heavier lines after that. So I might do kind of like tracing my construction lines here first, and then when I have lighter, when I'm kind of going back and filling in pieces, then I can go back and add that lighter tone. So that's a little bit out of order as I normally would do it, but there is no right and wrong with this kind of work. It's really what you're comfortable with. If you've got your construction lines the way you want, you're happy with it, this is really kind of something in between tracing and sketching. You know, this is not as challenging. You know, if I were to start off with pen right away, I would feel a little bit more apprehensive about how certain I am about the proportions. But here I'm feeling pretty good about it. It's kind of already been tested, so I shouldn't run into any surprises. Not the kind of thing that you want, especially when you're working in ink. And always just, as I'm going through some student work lately, I think the biggest thing is just making sure that you're leaving yourself time to do these drawings, because I have seen some students rush their work and that leads to scores that are not quite what I know you're capable of. So, you know, all of this kind of stuff comes with practice. So just make sure pause the video, take your time, come back to it, restart it again. That's the point of the this format where it's asynchronous and recorded. And always remember in this building, this is a concrete building, so everything has thickness, very little single line work. My goal is always to do these drawings within an hour. And so this is certainly more involved than some of the previous examples that we've gone through for these tutorials. Just try not to rush them. Focus on the things that will be more impactful. So obviously I've mentioned before, the boats may not be the kind of thing that you want to spend a lot of time on. That's fine. This neighboring building is another one. Maybe you could skip that. It's not that critical. The foreground here, I would argue, is more important. So try to work on these geometries. You can see this angle is changing as you move around this arc because they're all converging at a point in the middle of the building. That's because it's a circular object like a drum. So all of those are converging in one place. That's why the angles are changing. And these slab edges, if you've done those construction lines, you're happy with them. You can also start to see the arc of these. They flatten out a lot because they're getting closer and closer the lower we get to the horizon line. This is a soffit condition, so that will be dark later. When I come back, hopefully I can do a little bit of shading with graphite or colored pencil. I think I'm going to use graphite, not just because it's more malleable, I can work with it, but also because, like I mentioned before, I made the big mistake of, not protecting this page from the previous drawing of the Thompson Center. And so if I use colored pencil, I can't move it as well. So that means I will see what I did on that previous drawing much more easily than if I come back and render it in pencil. I can move that line work around a bit more. These are the vertical pickets for the railings at the slab edges. I'm spending more time here on this area because this is going to be, of course, the foreground. It's very visible. Okay. So I'm starting to see the building coming together now. The geometry is set. It's really just filling in some of the geometries I've already set up for myself. So hopefully with this tutorial, you can see what seems to be a complicated building, hopefully breaking it down just enough to make it seem a little bit less daunting. And again, I don't really want to spend too much time on this, but it is in the foreground, so I'm going to use this, continuously use this heavier line type. And part of the image is actually cut off, but I want to show a little bit more. So, and I have no idea what this boat looks like, but probably not terribly important. Actually, this is where that base of the building, it looks as if there are two walls that are kind of stacked on top of one another. There's a gray one, and then maybe something, either a metal seawall or a bunch of wooden boards that are driven into this side of the river here. This is a floating dock. As I come down here, you may not be able to see all of this, but this is again that cap as it meets the water, and another boat in the distance behind the building edge. I cannot see what is happening beyond there, so that is going to have to be shaded. Or you could make up some other. I'm I don't, actually don't recall if the building is totally open with only vertical elements behind it, or if there's actually building enclosure there. But if you can't see it, you can make it up or leave it alone. It's up to you. Just indicate vertical mullions here. It kind of wraps around. So, all right. So then here again, I'm starting to just layer in more and more information. This is the edge of the water. I'm going to focus on the balcony edges first, which look like big upside down U's at this scale. Really just emphasizing the slab edge here. And it is important to note that, I'm not counting the number of floors. I'm just kind of getting a proportion of each of these openings. And then as I come down, they flatten out again because they're getting closer and closer to that horizon line. So, but now that I have this number, I want to be consistent. So I don't want to have my neighboring grouping of windows here be totally different than the grouping or the number of slab or floor openings that I have for the balcony. So I'm going to start with a tick mark, that angle, and then again, the base of these is arcing up a little bit more each time I rise to a new floor, so that by the time I get to the top, I'm close to the arc I've established at the roof line. Take your time when you do this. I'm probably going even faster than I should be. And now the same thing here, I can see that there's actually two floors above. Each one of them has, it's almost as if each one of them steps up a little bit. You can see here the relationship of the balcony to the neighboring window, and it looks like it's rising up as if each one has added another story. Again, I want to make sure that I'm being consistent from one grouping to another, so I don't want to suddenly add, a third more floors between the same area, which is easy to do because it's not just a singular arc that I'm looking at. I have to actually take each one of these as its own little bit of an arc. I can't just draw a line across the whole thing from one to the other, one arc to another, then all again coming down. These special geometries Bertrand Goldberg is creating, it's as they come together, it's not the easiest thing to understand. When we draw it, it becomes more apparent how complex this building actually is. But again, with those construction lines, it should not, hopefully, as long as you kind of got through that first step, you come back with more intentional lines here without too much guesswork. Flattening out, making sure that we're still kind of showing, respecting that arc. Always checking yourself, because although you could end up without getting through that first step, you get to a point and you realize, oh, this is not arcing at all like the photo is. That flat line that I'm drawing is supposed to be where let's see, I've already, it's supposed to be where the window wall stops and the balcony begins. And I've already noticed in my haste, I've made a little bit of a oversight, which is, interestingly enough, the balconies come down, but then the last two don't have balconies. The last two are similar in their punched openings. I did not draw it that way, so shame on me, but that's fine. So here again, punched openings all the way up. And again, this is the most severe curve of all, because it has the most floors, and it also is the most foreshortened in that it's the arc of this is hooking the most towards us. So we're seeing it less in elevation as opposed to the neighboring pieces that we've drawn over here where it's more elevational. All right, so now I have a lot of the base, a lot of the core elements that I needed to get in. I kind of want to show that there's something happening in the distance here, even though I don't know what's going on because it's so dark, but I could become the designer here and start just indicating. I do believe that there's a path here that you can actually walk underneath this building because it's raised on stilts. You can walk under it and through it, even though it's hard to tell from the image that I have printed. I'm doing just some real gestural lines here with what's happening in the foreground with these boats and some small kind of tick marks and maybe another floating dock over here. All right. So I'm going to move now to my smaller line weight. This is going to be now my micron 1. This would actually be good for those lines that are scored within the concrete to indicate the form panel, also corresponding with the slab edges. And remember again with that, we are working on flattening out the further we go down the building to correspond to where we are in relation to the horizon line. And this can also be used for a little bit of that detail lines. So this is going to be the mullions in the punched window walls. Or even here, you could, I did part of that already with my heavier line weight, but that's a storefront. So much of this in the distance is glazed. I am not going to count the mullions. All I can tell is that there is a lot of glass that's recessed behind this. These kind of structural elements that rise all the way up to the top of the building. So I'm just going to show some tick marks indicating mullions. And down here, it's very, very dark. I don't even want to show, I might just show the thickness of the concrete pier, but I'm going to come back with probably graphite and make that quite dark. So I don't want to really show much down here. I could, now this is again up to you, very, very lightly just showing the edge of that neighboring building, the Reed, that was built only about maybe 4 or 5 years ago. But again, I don't want to show too much. I'm just going to show some of those slab edges and how those are vanishing to a point to the right. Some vertical element in it too. Again, I don't want to really spend time on it. I'm not, that building is not the focus of this. It has this kind of pattern of metal panels that change probably based on the unit type within that. Okay, so now I have, to a degree, a large amount of information, and really from here it's all kind of massaging some of that, adding a little bit more context, more detail. Maybe just going all the way up with the rendition of some of these vertical mullions. Don't have to draw them all, just enough to get the idea that this is glass. And I'm going to come back and I'm going to shade these so that it'll be more apparent that they are in fact glazed openings. So here I'm showing the majority of them and then they kind of taper off. And so I'll do that again here, just going all the way up, tick marks. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then maybe fall off to 2. And then 1, 1, 1. You don't really need much more than that because especially when I come back with more tone, I'm going to lose a lot of that detail anyway. I sometimes base the amount of information to put into a drawing on the amount of time I know I have for it. So this building, we could draw this in 10 hours. We could draw this in 5 or 10 minutes. And you have to understand how much time you have and achieve what it is that you know you can, based on your experience in drawing, how much you can get through within that time. So for me, this tutorial is, roughly an hour, hour, 15 minutes. So I know what I can get done in that amount of time. If I had less time, these kind of detail lines that I'm adding now, I would not do because, it's, of course, you get in information that you can, but it's not critical to the design of the building. I would like to show some of the reflectivity happening to make this clear as being a water element. I I know that at the edge of the water, I'm always going to have a bit more reflection that's happening at the edge there. But then I also want to just show some of the architecture coming down in being reflected as well. And here, and I'm going to keep doing this probably with graphite as well. So some of these lines I come in with pen, but then I can continue to do this with graphite. Okay, now I can't see some of what I'm doing here, but anyway. So I've got quite a bit of construction lines still showing here, and as I come in with more graphite, I'm going to lose a lot of that. But just to be safe, the last thing I want to do is really have to kind of surgically remove some of those lines after the fact. So I'm just going to come in with my kneaded eraser, clean up some of that line work. Maybe I don't, this is a step I might not have to take, but I have time. I can do this. It doesn't hurt. Now with the next few minutes, I am going to focus, so I started with graphite, I went to pen, and now I'm going to go into using a soft, this is I use this a lot. I was given a box of these Blackwing moleskins, but if you're going to be doing a lot of graphite shading, don't shade using your 4H. Actually, any of the H's, 4H, 3, 2H, H is probably okay. HB, that's what you're used to as your number 2. That's okay. Now you start getting into the soft stuff. B, B2, B3, all the way to B6. This is going to be basically what I've been using here. So this is going to be really high contrast. And again, that will give you the contrast, but it's also, you got to be careful as it's going to move on you a lot. If you start rubbing up against that, it's going to move. So I would say that the first thing here, if I want to really emphasize the curve of the building, I can start to see this is entering into an area of shade. So I can respect the way that the sun is hitting this building. Or I could say, like, you could see the difference between these two surfaces. They're not coplanar. They're roughly 90 degrees to one another, although this one is arcing slightly. But I don't really see a tonal change between them. So you have to ask yourself, do you want that? Or do you want, maybe this is really coming into sunlight and this is in shade, in which case because it's arcing, it wouldn't be a solid heavy line where you go from shade to light. It would be a small gradient as it makes the bend around this curve. So if this is being hit by sun, that means as it starts to arc around, it's getting less and less direct sun, and then this is actually in shade again. So that's what I'm going to do. I am going to make this a shade as if it's not being hit directly by sunlight, and then it's going to alternate to become more in the sun, so I can cast a little bit of sunlight on here, and then as I arc around, I'll get less and less. The alternative to this could be the sun is hitting this side, so you're really illuminating that being bright, and this is dark, and then it starts to change yet again. So you're kind of alternating from direct sunlight to shade, primarily shade, and then you arc back into sun. And the same thing here, where you're more in the shade as you wrap around yet again, and then it starts to open up into sun. So I would suggest not just kind of glossing over this whole thing with an even tone. It will look really flat. In order to make the kind of amp up the drama here, I would suggest taking a stand and really thinking about how light would hit these arced surfaces. So as I was talking through that, uh, for me, I'm thinking now, because this is in the foreground and I want to make this more prominent, I would like to see this in more light, so sunlight. That means if this is going to be primarily in sun, I would want this to be, so they're consistent, both of them facing towards the west. So I would consider this face as it turns the corner to be in more shadow. And again, I'm using a very soft pencil here, and a pencil that is on its side. So I'm not drawing my shade or shadow with a tip, because then you're going to see a lot of, first, it takes a lot longer to shade that way, but it also leaves you with a lot of individual lines. So as you can see by the image here, I'm now treating this side to be in shade. That means this one will be in shade. These two flat surfaces will be more in sun. So I'm going to go quickly to just shade some of those in a kind of medium tone, because I know I can go darker than this. I certainly can go much darker because I have a very soft pencil. And I also want to be able to reserve my darkest for where it really counts. That's going to be, the windows are going to be darker. This is where I mentioned I'm going to lose a lot of that mullion work, but some of you might not want to do, maybe you'll stick with a lot more of the tones or with the line work in ink, in which case you would see them. And I also want to be able to reserve some, so for not only just for the glazed areas, but for these soffits, and also keeping in mind how dark the underside of these soffits, the kind of recesses beyond, are. And again, be very mindful of the fact that these are, if you are in fact using, if you're using the colored pencil, you don't have to worry so much about this because the colored pencil isn't going to move on you. So I'm going to try to move more or less from left to right. I'm right-handed. If you are left-handed, then you would do the opposite. And then there are these dark spaces. This is going to be perhaps my darkest is the recesses that are directly underneath this lower level slab. That's getting the least amount of light. So it's understanding how much pressure to apply. And with pencil, you can go back, you can erase, you can move this around. It always helps to have a number of pencils ready to go, sharpened so that you're not stopping and starting after you've begun. Also, when you're teaching a tutorial, it's good not to stop and waste time on that kind of stuff. So sometimes I'll go almost like a wash, like we talked about with watercolor. You go across large areas with a medium tone, and then you can review and come back and start adding more and more tone where it's needed. But I know that I want to be able to give quite a bit of darkness to this face because this is the one I really want to amplify the idea that this is a curving element that's receiving light at different angles. So now there are these first two bays. Those are relatively dark because they're in shade. As I come around, maybe this third one is going to start to lighten up. It still has some tone. And then the other thing to remember is balconies are always going to be dark. They're recessed. They have the soffit is going to be a dark element to contend with. So I'm going to go back and add tone to each of them so that you can understand that that's the underside of that balcony. Same here. That's good. I want that to be the darkest. I want to make this, and it does actually appear that way in the photo as well. You see the darkest elements are directly underneath the slabs. The second level of dark would be the glazing itself. The slab edge is bright. That's capturing a lot of that direct light. So I want to stay clear of some of the slab edges so that they jump out more. And I'm going to come back and deal with the windows last. So here again, another arc, and then each time I come to a new arc, and I move from left to right, I want to open it up. So this one is the darkest all the way across. It's getting the least amount of light. This one is opening up. I can see it's half and half. Now maybe a third of this is dark. And then again, I come back and want to make sure that I'm really shading in that underside of the slab for the balconies again. And like I said, I'm going to come back and add the tone for the glass at the end. Okay. Because now these are starting to get light more than you saw it, where these are primarily in shadow. Okay, so now again, I'm coming back here. I can see the underside. I know that like my strategy is always to make sure that that's relatively dark. And I'm gonna lighten up a little bit. One of the things I want to reinforce, as dark as you want to make things, it's best not to go so dark that it just kills the paper because you can push so hard, especially with either really any graphite, whether it's an H or a B, and you end up damaging the paper, or you kind of take so much out of it that you're kind of not able to appreciate any of the paper quality. So I did this in college. I had a pastel or a charcoal drawing, and I went so deeply dark with some of the charcoal that the paper kind of got messed up. So always try to keep your pencil to a point, even if your darkest tones are pretty dark, don't go so dark as to hurt the paper. I'm starting to see some of my Thompson center lines coming through here now, like I was afraid of. Like there's one. And I'm going to show a little bit of this. So this is actually a shadow that's cast. You can see I'm showing these lines that are showing that that is still going to be in shadow, even if it is facing the sun, because it's underneath. It's not a horizontal surface, it's a vertical, but it's also not receiving sun because, of course, the sun is up in the sky and it's going to cast a shadow on the face of these columns like this. And again, I'm again dark down here at the base. All right, let me all right, so now I'm going to go back again and start layering in this kind of scalped effect. As we turn the corner, it's going to keep opening up a little bit, but I want to show that arc. As you get closer now, it changes. It's not just a singular form, it's actually broken up. And again, the underside, I'm going to make that dark again. Underside here. This is an interesting form. It actually goes vertical, then it switches and becomes the underside of that concrete panel, and then it starts to go vertically again. So I'm changing my treatment of that from dark to light. You can add just a little bit of tone, very, very lightly, just to show that those two surfaces are, in fact, getting different levels of light. So I've got probably about 5 minutes left, and I can keep working on this, of course. I'm trying to be mindful of your time, but I think that this is getting close to the place that I wanted it to be. And like I said before, I'm going to come back and just start to highlight with shade some of the glazing, because that's always going to be one of the darkest areas. I don't want it to be quite as dark as some of the soffits, but you can see here I'm adding tone, like a mid-gray tone. The underside still remains darker. And I do know that I didn't go exactly as I had suggested, going from left to right. But in that case, if you are concerned about how your paper is, if you're needing to rest your hand on the page, you can always use another piece of paper. That usually helps to avoid some of that smudging and the movement of these soft graphites. Now, you could go so far as add railings, like I had done here. Each one of these balconies, of course, has a railing, but at this scale, at this distance, I don't think that that's really evident. I don't think that adding that level of detail will be worthwhile. Maybe if you're only doing an ink drawing, that might become something that you want to do. But as soon as you start bringing tone into the equation, then you don't really appreciate the small line work anymore. It kind of gets washed out. So I'm just adding a little bit of tone here just so that you can appreciate that there is glazing that's darkest. It's not reflecting light at all. In some lights, it can, like if there's a sunset and it's reflecting back, that's a difficult thing to capture, especially in a graphite drawing. And so I could keep working. The foreground here is a little bare right now. I could continue doing this with more time. But the one thing, as I mentioned, with mixed media that I like to do, uh, I always come back to this idea of the highlights. So for instance, just with your sand or your light colored yellow, just adding a little highlights to show that this is kind of warm sunlight hitting this one side. And I don't take it around everywhere. Like it's not like I'm going to color in every space that is receiving direct light, but in this case, I could just add a little highlight to certain edges. And you have to be careful here because if you are using colored pencil and graphite, you run them over one another. The graphite again is going to move on you, so that you have to be careful not to interact too much with the graphite. And this concrete has a kind of warm tone to it. It's kind of brownish yellow. And again, see these pencils, they get really dull really quickly. So you have to make sure that you're, especially if you want to use them in a certain manner like this on the side, you have to make sure you have a tip to work with. These slab edges could get a little highlight. And so, I could always then go back and I could come back with some of the heavier line work and then try to amplify some of those profile edges like I had talked about before. Those heavier lines will make this appear to be lifted off the page more than it is. If all the lines in the base are looking the same, it might become a little bit less clear as to what's in front of what. And the sign pen would be good for this kind of drawing. The sign pen is really, really dark. It has a very heavy line quality to it. And that might be worth exploring, especially in the foreground. Things like this element in the front of the page towards the right, elevate that so that you can see that there is a recess in all of these areas towards the back of the image. So I'm going to work a little bit more on this, but I hope this has been helpful. And again, mixed media, work on what it is you're comfortable with, or if you want to explore more, of course, it's up to you. This is the sign pen. You can see how deep that line becomes. So I'll work a little bit more, but that's really the tutorial for today. And this will be due a week from today. I'll post this on the 15th, so the 22nd. That's the River City. And yeah, I'll be there at class on Friday, and we'll talk a bit more about our architectural plates, the process that goes into them, some examples, and hopefully you've been able to select the image or the building that you would like to document for that, because we'll do some cartooning and some development of those plates next week. All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening. I hope it's been helpful, and we will see you soon.